In your opinion, what has been Afreximbank's impact in African economies?
I think when you ask the question about economies, you have to look at either the continent as a whole or individual countries. As mentioned earlier, sometimes the bank was very concentrated in activities in, let's say, Nigeria or Zimbabwe, but that's because they were big trading nations. If you look at, let's say, Nigeria, with all the oil and gas and other commodities, Afreximbank played a role in financing the indigenous sector as they took over some of the businesses in the oil services sector and in agriculture, and they took those over from government and some of the large international investors. So Afreximbank was in a position to really support indigenous African initiatives. Also, I think if you look at Zimbabwe with the political issues that they've been and challenges that they've been going through, the private sector needed assistance in making sure that they could both import the inputs for the agricultural crops and then export their commodities. And Afreximbank concentrated on working with the private sector so that they would survive through these challenging times. I think the other thing that Afreximbank has done is they've become thought leaders for the continent. They've really understood and tackled the issue of intra-African trade and also looking at how Africa can add value for the export of their primary materials and commodities. And can they process or semi-process some of these goods in Africa to add value in Africa as opposed to offshore. I think some of the other challenges to intra-African trade remain the infrastructure across borders. Remember 25 years ago when they were comparing the African lions economies to the Asian tigers. And when we saw the statistics of what the intra-Asian trade was compared to Africa's, we said, there's a problem right there, and that's the primary issue that had to be addressed. So that's one of Afreximbank's big goals and responsibilities. Afreximbank can do its part. It's designed some new products to support the tourism industry, to support the processing of commodities in the continent, to support some of the infrastructure and the ports and the railways and tourism. But I think African governments also have to do more and do their part. The other thing that I think Africa needs to do to support, let's say, Afrexim in their initiatives is that to use some of their own national reserves and put those at the disposal of Afreximbank through either deposits with Afreximbank, but to provide funding so that that money is then reinvested in Africa, instead of the money going and sitting in the international banks, and whether it's Switzerland or New York or London, and earning minimum returns. Let's put that money to work in Africa and let it work for Africa's benefit.